Did you know that long before Twitter debates or YouTube arguments, medieval scholars duked it out in intellectual arenas that could get just as heated? What if the most brilliant minds of the 1000s and 1100s faced off in epic battles of logic and faith, shaping the very way we think? Brace yourself for some truly shocking intellectual showdowns from the medieval period, roughly between 500 CE and 1500 CE. Number 8. Marsilius of Padua, viz. Pope John XXII. Picture this. It is the early 1300s, a time when Europe is buzzing with political intrigue and big ideas about who should really be in charge. On one side, we have Pope John XXII, sitting in Avignon, France. He is a powerful figure, asserting that the Pope holds ultimate authority not just over spiritual matters, but also over worldly kings and emperors. He believes the Pope is God's direct representative on earth, with the power to crown and uncrown rulers. On the other side, we find Marsilius of Padua, a sharp-minded scholar and physician, who spent time at the University of Paris. He is brewing up some truly revolutionary thoughts about power. Marsilius believed that authority, especially political authority, should come from the people. This was a radical idea for his time. Put his thoughts into a massive book called Defensor Pacis, which translates to Defender of Peace. In this work, Marsilius argued that the Church's power should be limited strictly to spiritual guidance. He said that any laws the Church made were only valid if they were enforced by the secular government, and that even those laws were human laws, not direct divine commands. He challenged the very idea that the Pope had absolute power, saying that the ultimate authority in the Church should rest with a general council of believers, not just one person. This directly undermined the Pope's claim to supreme power. Pope John XXII, as you might expect, was not pleased. When word of Defensor Pacis reached him, he quickly condemned it as filled with heresies. The Pope saw Marsilius's arguments as a direct attack on the established order of the Church and on his own divine right to rule. It was a clash between two fundamentally different visions of society, one where spiritual power dictated worldly affairs, and another where the people, through their chosen leaders, held the reins of governance. The intellectual rivalry between Marsilius and Pope John XXII was not confined to academic debates. It spilled directly into the political arena. Marsilius found refuge and support with Louis IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was himself locked in a fierce power struggle with Pope John XXII. Marsilius became a key advisor to Louis, providing the intellectual ammunition for the emperor's defiance of the Pope. Marsilius argued that Louis IV did not need papal approval to be a legitimate emperor. In a highly symbolic act, Marsilius even helped Louis IV to arrange his own coronation in Rome, performed by the people of Rome, directly challenging the Pope's traditional role in anointing emperors. This was more than just a war of words. It was a battle over who truly commanded the loyalty and obedience of medieval Europe. The Pope issued papal bulls, official decrees, against Marsilius, condemning his doctrines and excommunicating him and his collaborator, John of Jandun. Marsilius, meanwhile, continued to write and refine his arguments from the emperor's court, reinforcing the idea that the power of rulers came from the consent of the governed, not from the Church. Their rivalry highlighted the intense and often dangerous stakes involved when new intellectual currents challenged centuries of established power and belief. Core of their conflict was about where ultimate authority truly resided, with the divine representative on earth or with the collective will of the people. This intellectual showdown sent ripples throughout Europe, laying some of the groundwork for future political thought that would eventually challenge monarchies and papal power. Number 7. Roger Bacon, vs. the Parisian scholastic establishment. Imagine the bustling intellectual hub of 13th century Paris. Scholars from all over Europe flock there, especially to its famous university. The dominant method of learning is scholasticism, a way of thinking that uses logic and argument to make sense of everything from philosophy to theology. Debates are sharp, and professors are masters of deductive reasoning. Then comes Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar and scholar from Oxford, with a very different idea of how knowledge should be acquired. He is ready to take on the entire Parisian establishment. Bacon believed that while logic and authority were important, they were not enough. He argued passionately for something more: empirical observation, the careful study of mathematics, and the power of experimental science. He felt that the scholars in Paris, while brilliant, were too focused on abstract ideas and too reliant on old texts without truly testing them against the real world. He respected figures like Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas, who were synthesizing Aristotle's philosophy with Christian thought. But Bacon felt they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. He wanted scholars to get their hands dirty, to observe, measure, and experiment. Intellectual rivalry between Bacon and the Parisian scholastic establishment was less about one-on-one debates and more about a clash of methodologies. Bacon laid out his vision in several large works, including his Opus Majus, Opus Minus, and Opus Tertium, which he wrote at the request of Pope Clement IV. In these books, he did not hold back his criticisms of his contemporaries, pointed out what he saw as the four main errors hindering true knowledge: the acceptance of undeserved authority without question, the blind adherence to long and stubborn custom, the sway of the opinion of the ignorant crowd, and the clever way some scholars tried to hide their own ignorance under the show of wisdom. Bacon was convinced that experimental science was the key to unlocking deeper truths, even theological ones. He believed that observing phenomena, performing experiments, and using mathematics to understand the world would lead to more certain knowledge than just endless logical arguments based on inherited texts. He pushed for the study of languages like Greek and Hebrew so that scholars could read biblical texts in their original forms, rather than relying on potentially flawed translations. He even envisioned future technologies like flying machines and self-propelled boats, which were far beyond the scope of traditional scholastic thought. His imitative ideas and his sharp, direct criticisms of the prevailing academic methods earned him suspicion and even opposition from within his own Franciscan order. His superiors saw his suspect novelties as a threat to the established way of doing things. He was reportedly confined or imprisoned by his order at various times for these views. Bacon's intellectual challenge was not just about specific philosophical points. It was about the fundamental approach to knowledge itself. He argued that scholasticism, for all its logical rigor, was too abstract and disconnected from the tangible world. He believed that true wisdom lay in a hands-on engagement with nature and in the rigorous application of mathematics. His rivalry with the dominant scholastic mindset in Paris, while not a direct face-to-face contest, was a profound intellectual battle over the very future of learning. He argued for a paradigm shift, a movement towards empirical inquiry that would eventually gain momentum centuries later. Number 6. John Duns Scotus vs. Thomists. The late 13th and early 14th centuries were a vibrant time in medieval academia. Thomas Aquinas, the brilliant Dominican friar, had passed away, but his ideas were quickly becoming hugely influential across European universities. His followers, often called Thomists, were busy explaining and defending his philosophical and theological system, but not everyone agreed with every detail of Aquinas's grand synthesis. Enter John Duns Scotus, a Franciscan friar, and another incredibly sharp mind known as the Dr. Subtilis for his incredibly precise and subtle distinctions. He was ready to challenge some of the core tenets of the emerging Thomist school. Scotus taught at both Oxford and Paris, and his intellect was legendary. His rivalry with the Thomists was not a personal feud with Aquinas himself, who was already deceased, but a vigorous intellectual engagement with the growing body of Thomist thought. These debates often took place in the form of commentaries on Peter Lombard's Sentences, a standard theological textbook of the time, and in Quaestiones Disputae, formal academic debates where scholars argued specific questions. One of the central points of contention between Scotus and the Thomists was the relationship between God's will and God's intellect, and by extension the role of will and intellect in human action. Aquinas emphasized the intellect's primacy. For Aquinas, God's intellect first comprehends what is good and true, and then God's will chooses it. Similarly, in humans, the intellect presents what is good, and the will then chooses. Scotus, however, argued for the primacy of the will both in God and in humans. For Scotus, God's will is absolutely primary and free. A thing is good because God wills it to be good, not because it is inherently good, and then God wills it. This idea, called voluntarism, meant that God's freedom was absolute and not bound by any prior intellectual necessity, even in determining moral law. This was a direct challenge to the Thomist emphasis on divine intellect. Another area of subtle but profound disagreement involved the nature of universals, those abstract concepts like humanity or redness. While both Aquinas and Scotus were realists, meaning they believed universals had some basis in reality, Scotus developed his unique concept of hexity, or thisness. For Scotus, each individual thing possesses a unique, singular form that makes it precisely this thing, distinct from all others, even those of the same species. This thisness is what gives an individual its absolute uniqueness, and it was a more pronounced emphasis on individuality than found in Thomist thought. Perhaps one of the most famous theological battlegrounds between Scotus and the Thomists was the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. While Aquinas had not explicitly supported the idea that Mary was conceived without original sin, arguing against it based on the need for Christ's redemption, Scotus famously and brilliantly defended it. He argued that it was perfectly within God's power to preserve Mary from original sin from the very moment of her conception as a most perfect form of redemption. This became a key theological position for the Franciscan order, often putting them in direct opposition to the Dominicans, who largely followed Aquinas' earlier reservations. The rivalry between Scotus and the Thomists was not hostile in the modern sense, but it was incredibly intense and intellectually rigorous. It involved detailed analysis of texts, logical deductions, and profound theological arguments. The Scotist and Thomist schools developed into distinct, often opposing intellectual traditions, each with its own preferred approaches and answers to the biggest questions of their time. These intellectual clashes shaped the very fabric of medieval theology and philosophy for centuries to come. Number 5. William of Ockham, viz. John Lutherell. The early 14th century was a time of immense change and tension, both in the world of ideas and in the political landscape. Power struggle between secular rulers and the papacy was heating up, and philosophical debates were becoming sharper and more daring. In this exciting and dangerous environment, two figures emerged with profoundly different views: William of Ockham, a brilliant Franciscan friar, and John Lutherell, the Chancellor of Oxford University. Their rivalry was not just about academic theories. It had real-world consequences. William of Ockham, known as the Doctor Invincibilis for his formidable debating skills, was famous for his principle of Occam's razor, which states that entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. This idea reflected his broader philosophical approach, which aimed to simplify explanations and eliminate unnecessary assumptions. He taught at Oxford and was quickly gaining a reputation for his radical ideas. John Luttrell, on the other hand, was a staunch defender of traditional scholasticism and, crucially, a firm supporter of papal authority. As Chancellor of Oxford, he held a position of significant power within the academic world. He saw Occam's new ideas as dangerous and potentially heretical. The rivalry truly kicked off when Luttrell, concerned about Occam's teachings, took direct action. He compiled a list of propositions, specific statements from Occam's writings, and sent them to Pope John XXII, who was residing in Avignon, France. Luttrell effectively accused Occam of heresy, setting the stage for a major intellectual and ecclesiastical confrontation. One of the central philosophical disagreements was over the nature of universals. Occam challenged the prevailing realist views that held that universals, like humanity or roundness, had some form of real existence outside of individual things or the human mind. For Occam, universals were merely concepts, or names, noumena, mental constructs that we use to group similar individual things. Only individual things truly exist. This radical form of nominalism was a direct threat to many established philosophical and theological doctrines of the time. If universals were just names, how did that affect our understanding of, say, the Trinity or the unity of humanity in Christ? Beyond the purely philosophical, the rivalry became deeply entangled with the political tensions of the day, particularly concerning papal authority. Occam found himself embroiled in the major controversy between Pope John XXII and Louis IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. Occam sided firmly with the emperor, arguing fiercely against the Pope's temporal power and challenging the very idea of papal infallibility. He advocated for a more decentralized view of church governance, suggesting that a general council of the church had more authority than the Pope alone. This was a direct intellectual assault on the position that John Luttrell so strongly defended. Occam was summoned to Avignon by the Pope to answer for his teachings. He spent years under a kind of house arrest defending his ideas. Although he was never formally condemned for heresy, his propositions were deemed suspect. His escape from Avignon with Emperor Louis IV was a dramatic turn of events, solidifying his role as a key intellectual opponent of the papacy. Their rivalry was a classic example of how abstract philosophical ideas could have profound implications for real-world power structures. Luttrell sought to uphold the existing order and its intellectual foundations. Occam, with his razor-sharp logic, dismantled those foundations, paving the way for new ways of thinking about knowledge, reality, and authority. Their intellectual battle continued through their writings, with Occam spending the rest of his life in exile, tirelessly writing treatises against the Pope, ensuring their clash resonated throughout Europe. Number 4. Bonaventure v. Thomas Aquinas. The mid-13th century was an exciting and budding period at the University of Paris. The full works of Aristotle, previously largely unknown in the West, were now being translated into Latin and eagerly studied. This influx of new philosophical ideas, particularly from a pagan philosopher, presented a huge challenge and opportunity for Christian theologians. How could these new insights be integrated with Christian faith? Two giants of medieval thought, Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas, approached this question from very different angles, setting up a fascinating intellectual rivalry. Bonaventure, a Franciscan friar, was known as the Dr. Seraphicus because of his profound spiritual wisdom and his emphasis on the love of God. He was a master of theology at Paris and a strong defender of the traditional Augustinian approach to theology, which emphasized divine illumination, mysticism, and the soul's journey back to God. He saw the world and knowledge as primarily a ladder leading to spiritual contemplation. Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar, was known as the Doctor Angelicus for his brilliant intellect and systematic theology. He was also a master of theology at Paris, at the same time as Bonaventure. Aquinas was a bold champion of integrating Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine. He believed that reason had a powerful capacity to discover truth, and that grace perfects nature, meaning that human reason and natural abilities could be elevated and completed by divine grace, rather than being inherently flawed or needing constant divine intervention to function. Core of their rivalry centered on how to incorporate Aristotle into Christian thought. Aquinas enthusiastically embraced Aristotle's metaphysics, his ethical theories, and his natural philosophy. He believed that Aristotle's rational system could provide a solid philosophical framework for understanding Christian truths. For example, Aristotle's ideas about causation and being helped Aquinas develop his arguments for God's existence. Bonaventure, however, was much more cautious. He viewed some Aristotelian concepts as potentially dangerous to Christian faith, especially those that seemed to contradict traditional teachings. He worried about ideas like the eternity of the world, which contradicted the Christian doctrine of creation and time, or Aristotle's apparent rejection of divine ideas as exemplary causes for creation. Bonaventure felt that too much reliance on Aristotle could lead to a separation of faith and reason, or even to the idea that reason could grasp ultimate truths without the need for divine guidance. Their disagreement also touched upon the very nature of knowledge. Bonaventure maintained that true and certain knowledge, especially of spiritual truths, required divine illumination. He believed that the human intellect, wounded by sin, needed God's direct help or illumination to grasp universal and eternal truths. For Bonaventure, the ultimate goal of philosophy was to lead to contemplation and spiritual union with God. Aquinas, on the other hand, argued that human reason, through its natural powers, could acquire significant knowledge of the world and even of God simply by observing creation and using logical deduction. While he acknowledged the need for grace for supernatural truths, he believed that philosophy had its own distinct domain and methods for seeking truth, preparing the ground for theology, but not always needing direct divine intervention to function. Bonaventure and Aquinas were contemporaries, colleagues who lived and taught in the same university city, even participating in some of the same public disputations. Their debates were respectful, reflecting their deep commitment to truth and their shared faith, but they also defined two major and distinct paths for Christian thought in response to the Aristotelian challenge. Their differing approaches influenced their respective religious orders, with Franciscans often leaning towards Bonaventure's Augustinian perspective and Dominicans embracing Aquinas' Aristotelian synthesis. Their rivalry was a sophisticated battle of ideas, shaping how future generations would understand the relationship between faith, reason, philosophy, and theology. Number 3. Thomas Aquinas vs. Siger of Brabant. Step back into the bustling 13th century Paris, a time when the University of Paris was the intellectual powerhouse of Europe. The arrival of Aristotle's works in Latin, along with commentaries from Arab scholars like Averroes, had stirred up a philosophical storm. This period was a crucible for new ideas, but also a source of intense intellectual friction. In the midst of this, two brilliant minds stood on opposite sides of a crucial debate. Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican friar dedicated to synthesizing Aristotle with Christian theology, and Siger of Brabant, a master in the Faculty of Arts who was a leading figure of a controversial intellectual movement, often called Latin Averroism. Aquinas aimed to show that Aristotelian philosophy, when properly understood, was not a threat to Christian faith, but could actually serve as a powerful tool for understanding it. He believed that faith and reason, both coming from God, could not ultimately contradict each other. Siger, on the other hand, was deeply influenced by Averroes, an Islamic philosopher who had interpreted Aristotle in ways that seemed to clash directly with Christian doctrine. Siger and his followers rigorously pursued philosophical conclusions based purely on reason, even if those conclusions appeared to contradict theological beliefs. The central point of their intellectual rivalry revolved around the nature of the intellect. Siger, following Averroes, argued for the idea of a unity of the intellect. This meant that there was only one universal separate intellect that all human beings shared, rather than each person having their own individual intellect. Imagine a single shared consciousness that all people tapped into. This idea had massive implications. If the intellect was universal and not individual, it became very difficult to explain individual human immortality or personal responsibility for one's actions. Aquinas saw this as a direct and dangerous assault on core Christian doctrines. He wrote a specific treatise on the unity of the intellect against the Averroists to vehemently argue against Siger's position, defending the individuality of the human soul and intellect. Another heated area of debate concerned the eternity of the world. Aristotle, as interpreted by Averroes, suggested that the world had no beginning in time, meaning it was eternal. This directly contradicted the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, that God created the world out of nothing at a specific point in time. Siger and the Averroists, based on philosophical reasoning, were inclined to defend the eternity of the world. Aquinas, while respecting Aristotle's philosophical arguments, meticulously showed that reason alone could not definitively prove or disprove the world's eternity. He argued that the world's beginning in time was a truth known through faith, not a conclusion of philosophy. While Siger himself might not have explicitly taught a double truth theory, the idea that something could be true philosophically but false theologically, or vice versa, his rigorous adherence to philosophical conclusions, regardless of theological imputations, often led his critics to accuse him of doing so. Aquinas, in stark contrast, insisted on the ultimate harmony of faith and reason. He believed that truth was one, and what was truly rational could not contradict what was truly revealed by God. The intellectual clash between Aquinas and Siger was not just academic. It had serious consequences. Their debates were central to the infamous condemnations of 1270 and 1277 issued by the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tempier. These condemnations explicitly targeted many propositions associated with Latin Averroism, some of which were held by Siger and his followers. Sigur's views were seen as a direct threat to fundamental Christian beliefs, leading to a profound intellectual and theological crisis in Paris. Their rivalry was a high-stakes intellectual battle over the boundaries of reason, the nature of humanity, and the relationship between philosophical inquiry and divine revelation. Number 2. Anselm of Canterbury, Fee S. Roscellinus. Let's go back even further in time, to the late 11th and early 12th centuries. This was the very dawn of scholasticism, a period when scholars began to apply rigorous logic and philosophical reasoning to theological questions. One of the very first and most fundamental debates that sparked furious arguments among these early scholastics was the problem of universals. And at the heart of this early intellectual fireworks display were two very different thinkers, Anselm of Canterbury and Roscellinus. Anselm, a Benedictine monk, and later the Archbishop of Canterbury, is often called the father of scholasticism. He was a towering intellectual figure, known for his famous ontological argument for God's existence and his satisfaction theory of atonement. Anselm was a strong realist when it came to universals. This meant he believed that abstract concepts like humanity or justice or color had a real independent existence, not just as ideas in our minds, but in some sense they were real entities that individual things shared in. Roscellinus, a master from Compiègne, held a radically different view. He is often considered one of the earliest nominalists, or at least a very strong anti-realist. Roscellinus argued that universals were nothing more than flatus vocis, which literally means a puff of voice, or a mere sound. In other words, for Rosalinus, concepts like humanity were just words or names that we apply to individual things. Only individual things like Socrates or Plato truly existed. There was no real humanity existing separately from individual humans. The intellectual rivalry between Anselm and Rosalinus came to a head over the theological implications of Rosalinus's nominalism, particularly concerning the doctrine of the Trinity. If universals were just names, Rosalinus argued, then to say that the three persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, were one God, might mean they were merely three distinct individuals who were somehow called God. Anselm and many others saw this as a dangerous heresy, leading directly to tritheism, the belief in three separate gods rather than one God in three persons. Anselm was horrified by Rosalinus's application of nominalism to such a central Christian doctrine. He vigorously opposed Rosalinus's views, seeing them as undermining the very unity of God and the orthodox understanding of the Trinity. Anselm wrote a specific work, De Incarnatione Verbi, or On the Incarnation of the Word, to directly refute Rosalinus's perceived errors. In this work, Anselm defended the traditional understanding of the Trinity, arguing that the divine nature was a real shared essence that the three persons possessed, not merely a name applied to three distinct entities. Conflict led to Rosalinus being condemned at the Council of Soissons in 1092. Under pressure, he recanted his views, but he later returned to them. This rivalry, though perhaps less famous in common knowledge than some later ones, was absolutely foundational. It marked one of the earliest and most dramatic clashes over the fundamental nature of reality and its profound consequences for theology. The debate over universals sparked by this initial encounter between Anselm and Rosalinus would go on to be a central intellectual battlegrounds in medieval philosophy for centuries, shaping how scholars thought about everything from logic to God. Number 1. Peter Abelard v.S. William of Champeaux. Hold on tight, because this is where the intellectual fireworks truly begin, at the very start of the 12th century in Paris, the city that was quickly becoming the epicenter of medieval learning. This rivalry is the stuff of legend, a classic tale of a brilliant, arrogant young student challenging his renowned teacher and winning. The main characters are Peter Abelard, the sharpest mind of his generation, and William of Champeaux, one of the most respected logicians and teachers of the time. William of Champeaux was Abelard's teacher, and he held a prominent position in the nascent University of Paris. He was a leading figure in the ongoing problem of universals, the debate about whether abstract concepts like humanity or greenness exist as real things, or just as ideas in our minds. William initially championed a strong realist position known as the material identity theory. He argued that a universal like humanity exists wholly and entirely in each individual human being. So the humanity in Socrates is identical in essence to the humanity in Plato. They differ only by their accidental qualities, like their shape or location. Enter Peter Abelard, a young scholar brimming with confidence and an unparalleled gift for logic and dialectic, the art of formal debate. Abelard was one of William's students, but he was not content to simply absorb his teacher's wisdom. He famously challenged William's material identity theory in public disputations, which were academic debates where scholars argued their points vigorously. Abelard's argument was devastatingly simple. If the humanity in Socrates is truly identical to the humanity in Plato, then, logically, Socrates is Plato. This conclusion, of course, was absurd. Abelard's sharp critique forced William of Champeaux to revise his position. William shifted his theory to what is called the indifference theory. He now argued that universals are not identical in essence, but are indifferent to individuals. This meant that individuals of the same species are alike in essence, but not identical. For example, all humans are human, but they are not the same human. Abelard, however, was not satisfied. He continued to critique this refined position, arguing that it was merely a verbal distinction and did not solve the fundamental problem. Eventually, Abelard developed his own ground-drained view, which is often called conceptualism. For Abelard, universals are not real things existing outside the mind, but rather concepts that the mind forms. We observe common properties among individual things, and then our minds create a concept, a universal, to categorize them. So, while universals exist in things as common properties, they exist post-rem, after things as concepts in the mind. They are mental constructs that allow us to understand the world. This rivalry was highly personal and incredibly public. Abelard's intellectual prowess and his ability to dismantle William's arguments in open debate led to a humiliating public defeat for William of Champeaux. This moment marked a spectacular rise for Peter Abelard, establishing him as the leading intellectual figure of his time and sending students flocking to his lectures. Their clash over the problem of universals was not just an academic exercise. It was a defining moment in the development of early scholasticism. It showcased the immense power of logical argument and dialectic in medieval academia and directly influenced the direction that future philosophical debates on the nature of reality would take. It was a true intellectual battle fought with words and logic, but with consequences that rippled through the entire intellectual landscape of the Middle Ages.